The safety officer held the brand new Kevlar helmet out like it was a gift, and for a moment the whole firing line went quiet. "Sir, I can't let you on my range without proper head protection. This is non-negotiable." The old man didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. He just looked at the helmet in the younger man's hands, then looked past him toward the parking lot, toward an old blue pickup truck rusting quietly in the Arizona sun. "I appreciate the offer, son," he said, "but I already have a helmet, and it's already done its job once." Somebody in the back of the group laughed. A kid in $500 plate carriers and wraparound shades muttered something about Grandpa and the Smithsonian. The old man didn't flinch. He turned, slow and deliberate, and started walking back toward that truck. Nobody on that firing line, not the instructor, not the shooters, not the man with the clipboard, had any idea what was sitting inside the glove box of that F-150, or what the next 15 minutes were going to teach every single one of them about the word respect. If you believe every veteran deserves to be listened to before he's laughed at, do me a favor right now and type the words "Welcome Home" down in the comments. Because this old man is about to be welcomed home in a way none of us saw coming. His name was Walter Hollis, and he was 77 years old the morning he drove out to the Copper Ridge Tactical Range with a thermos of black coffee, a brown paper bag containing a ham sandwich his late wife's sister had made him, and a rifle he had owned longer than the instructor had been alive. Walter lived alone in a single-story house 15 miles outside of Prescott, on a piece of high desert land where the wind came down off the mountains in the afternoon and rattled the screen door he kept meaning to fix. His wife Ruth had passed almost 4 years ago now, and the silence in the house had a shape to it, a weight, something he had learned to sit with the way a man learns to sit with an old injury. He still put 2 coffee cups out every morning out of habit, and every morning he put one of them back in the cupboard without ever pouring into it. He wasn't a showy man. He wore the same brown canvas work jacket he had bought at a feed store in 1991. His boots were older than that. When he walked a little stiff in the right hip, the kind of stiffness that didn't come from age alone, the kind that a doctor had once described as consistent with old trauma. Walter had never corrected him. In the inside pocket of that canvas jacket, folded into a worn leather wallet, was a black and white photograph of a 19-year-old boy in jungle fatigues, smiling the way you only smile when you haven't seen the worst of the world yet. The boy in the photograph and the man driving the pickup were the same person, separated by 58 years and a valley in central Vietnam that most of the people at Copper Ridge Tactical that morning had never heard of, and if they had heard of it, they wouldn't have believed the man in the canvas jacket had ever been within 5,000 miles of it. Copper Ridge Tactical was the kind of place that had grown up fast in the last 10 years, a high-end civilian range tucked into a gravel draw at the base of the foothills, with a steel gate, a log cabin office, and a gravel parking lot full of late-model pickups and SUVs, wearing subdued, thin blue-line stickers and unit patches from deployments that had ended a decade ago. The owner and lead instructor was a man named Jesse Cade, 34 years old, a former Marine infantryman who had done 2 tours in Helmand Province and come home and built this range with his brother-in-law and a line of credit from a bank in Phoenix. Jesse was good at what he did. He was fit and fast and organised, and he ran his courses the way he'd been taught to run a squad. Everything by the book, everything checked twice, no excuses, no exceptions. The weekend carbine course he was running that Saturday was a 2-day intensive that cost $650 and drew a mix of off-duty cops, weekend warriors, a couple of young men who worked private security in Phoenix, and one retired dentist from Scottsdale who had been collecting AR-15s for years and finally decided he wanted to learn to actually use one. The morning light was still soft when the first student started pulling in, and Jesse was already on his 3rd cup of coffee, checking names off his clipboard, when he heard the unmistakable rattle of an old American 6-cylinder coming up the gravel road. He looked up and he saw the blue F-150, and the first thing he thought, honest to God, was that some old rancher had taken the wrong turn looking for a feed store. He had no idea the most important morning of his professional life had just driven onto his property. Walter parked at the far end of the lot, away from the newer trucks, out of habit more than anything. He sat in the cab for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel the way older men do, the way that looks like prayer even when it isn't, and then he reached for the door handle and stepped out. The gravel crunched under his boots. He pulled his rifle case from behind the seat, a battered hard case, olive drab, the foam inside cut to fit a Colt Sporter he had bought in 1986. and walked slowly toward the log cabin office. Jesse met him at the door with a polite smile and a clipboard. "Morning, sir. You signed up for the carbine course?" Walter nodded once. "Hollis, Walter Hollis." Jesse ran his pen down the list, found the name, and then looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. A thing he didn't even register consciously. A small animal instinct telling him the man in front of him was not what his eyes were seeing. And then the instinct passed, and Jesse smiled again, more brightly this time. The kind of bright smile younger men use when they're trying to be kind to someone they've already decided is out of place. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hollis. Got you right here. We're going to start the safety brief in about 10 minutes. Can I get you to sign these waivers and get you set up with a helmet?" Walter's hand paused halfway to the clipboard. "A helmet," he said. "For a rifle course?" Jesse nodded, still smiling. "New range policy, sir. Everyone wears modern head protection on the line. Kevlar's for everyone. We had an incident last year, a ricochet, and the insurance company. Well, it's mandatory now. No exceptions." Walter looked at him for a long moment, and then, very quietly, he said, "Son, I don't think I'll be needing one of those." Jesse's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes began to narrow, the way a man's eyes narrow when he suspects he's about to have a long conversation he did not plan on having. 300 miles away, in a glass-walled office on the top floor of a building in San Antonio, a man was just sitting down at his desk with a cup of coffee and a printout of the day's schedule. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours someone was going to call him, and he was going to stand up and walk out of that office without telling his secretary where he was going, because of a name he had not spoken out loud in 58 years. The safety brief was held in a 3-sided pavilion at the edge of the gravel lot. Plastic chairs arranged in a semicircle, a whiteboard propped against a sawhorse. Walter sat in the back row, his canvas jacket zipped up to the second snap, his hands folded on top of the rifle case across his knees. The other students filed in around him, 12 of them in total, and Walter could feel the small shift in the air that happens whenever a man his age sits down among men half his age in a place like this. The dentist from Scottsdale gave him a friendly nod. The 2 private security guys from Phoenix glanced at him, and then glanced at each other, and then looked straight ahead. The kid in the expensive plate carrier sat 3 seats down and did not look at Walter at all, because Walter had already been filed away in his head, as a non-factor, as background, as a man who was not part of the story he was telling himself about his own Saturday. Jesse stood at the front with a marker and began to run through the brief the way he ran through it every weekend, crisp and confident, covering muzzle discipline and trigger discipline, and cold range procedures and medical protocols. And when he got to the section on personal protective equipment, he paused and looked directly at the back row. "One more thing, folks. New policy this year. Everyone on my firing line wears a Kevlar helmet. I've got a stack of them in the cabin, various sizes, they're clean, they're inspected, they're yours to use for the weekend. No helmet, no line. Are we clear on that?" 11 heads nodded. Walter did not. Jesse looked at him for a long count. "Mr. Hollis, are we clear on the helmet policy?" Walter met his eyes calmly. "I heard you, son. I respect your policy, but I've got my own helmet in the truck and I'll be wearing that one." A small, uncertain laugh went through the pavilion. Jesse did not laugh. "Sir, with all due respect, I can't let a piece of unknown head protection on my firing line. It has to be approved gear, inspected gear, rated for modern rifle velocities. I'm sure whatever you've got in your truck is sentimental, but it's not going to meet range standards." Walter nodded slowly as if he had expected exactly those words. "Son," he said, "that helmet in my truck has already been tested at modern rifle velocities, and it passed." The kid in the plate carrier snorted. Jesse did not even hear him. He was staring at Walter with the beginning of an expression that was no longer polite, and he did not yet understand why the skin on the back of his neck had just gone cold. Alone for a moment while Jesse moved on to the rest of the brief, Walter let his eyes drift up toward the ridge above the range, where the morning light was still catching the tops of the scrub oak, and he felt something slow and familiar move through his chest. He was not angry at the young instructor. He had never been much good at being angry at young men. He had been a young man himself once, in a place where being young had meant something very specific and very terrible. And he had learned early that anger was a luxury you could not afford when you were trying to keep 14 other 19-year-olds alive in the dark. What he felt, sitting there in that plastic chair, was something closer to tiredness. Tiredness at having to explain himself. tiredness at the way the world kept asking men like him to prove they belonged in rooms they had paid for with blood. He thought of Ruth, who had understood without being told. Ruth, who had been the one who picked up the steel pot from the back of the closet every few years and dusted it off and set it on the dresser and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He thought of the boy in the photograph in his wallet, and how that boy would have been astonished to learn he was going to live to be 77, and how some mornings Walter himself was still astonished. He had come to this range for one reason. He wanted to squeeze a trigger again with other shooters around him. He wanted to hear the sound of rifles in the clean desert air and feel, for a few hours, like he was part of something that was still happening, instead of something that had already ended. That was all. He had not come here to fight anyone, but he was not going to take off that helmet, not for Jesse, not for the insurance company, not for anyone. The brief ended, and the student stood up and began moving toward the firing line, and Jesse walked straight over to Walter with the Kevlar in his hands and his jaw set. "Mr. Hollis, I'm going to ask you one more time, as a courtesy. Please put this on. If you refuse, I'm going to have to refund your course fee and ask you to leave." Walter looked at the helmet. Then he looked at Jesse. "All right, son," he said. "Walk with me to my truck. I want to show you something, and then you can decide." Jesse hesitated. Something in the old man's voice, not in the words, but in the way the words sat on top of each other, made him hesitate. And then, because he did not know what else to do, he nodded once and followed Walter across the gravel lot. The other students watched them go. The kid in the plate carrier rolled his eyes and said something under his breath to the guy next to him. The dentist from Scottsdale stood very still and watched the old man's back as he walked. And later, when the dentist told this story to his wife over dinner, he would say that he had known, even then, that something was about to happen that he was going to remember for the rest of his life. At the far end of the lot, Walter reached into the bed of the pickup and lifted out a canvas duffel bag, weathered and stained. The kind of bag you don't buy. The kind of bag the army issues you. He set it on the tailgate, he unzipped it slowly, and he reached inside. What came out of that duffel bag was a helmet, but it was not the helmet Jesse Cade had been expecting. It was an M1 steel pot, old army issue, the olive drab paint faded almost to grey on the crown, with a dark stain near the rim that Jesse's brain refused for a full second to identify as what it actually was. There was a web liner inside, cracked and yellowed with age, and a chin strap that had been repaired at some point with a piece of saddle leather. The helmet was not a museum piece. It was not clean. It had not been polished up and set on a shelf and cared for the way collectors care for things. It had been used, and then it had been set aside, and then it had been carried forward through 58 years by a man who could not bring himself to throw it away, and could not bring himself to display it either. But that was not what made Jesse Cade's mouth go dry. What made Jesse Cade's mouth go dry was the dent. It was on the left side of the helmet, just above where the temple of a wearer's head would be, a deep, ugly gouge in the steel about the size and shape of a man's thumb pressed hard into soft clay. The metal around the dent was pushed inward and slightly puckered, the way metal pushes when something hits it very fast and very hard and does not quite get through. There was no hole. Whatever had hit that helmet had been stopped by it, and whoever had been wearing it at the time had, by every law of physics Jesse Cade understood, come within about 1/16 of an inch of dying. Walter lifted the steel pot in both hands, the way a man lifts something that has been heavy for a long time, and he set it on his head and buckled the chin strap under his chin. Then he turned and looked at Jesse. "This helmet," he said quietly, "was tested on November 15th, 1965, in a place called the Ia Drang Valley. It passed the test. I don't think your Kevlar has any tests it needs to be ashamed of, son, but it's going to have to pass them on somebody else's head. This is the one I wear." And what Jesse Cade did not know, what none of them knew, was that standing about 40 yards away at the edge of the observation area, leaning against the hood of a black Suburban with government plates, was a quiet, grey-haired man in a windbreaker who had just seen that dent for the first time in 58 years, and who was already reaching for the phone in his pocket with a hand that had suddenly started to shake. Jesse Cade was a smart man. He was not a cruel man. He had buried friends in Afghanistan, and he knew what the inside of grief looked like, and he prided himself on recognizing the real thing when he saw it. But he was also a young man running a business, and he had a clipboard and a policy and 11 other paying students waiting on the line, and his pride was standing in the gravel lot of his own range being quietly, publicly contradicted by a 77-year-old man in a canvas jacket. So he did what a lot of young men do when their pride is hurt and they do not yet understand what they are looking at. He doubled down. "Mr. Hollis," he said, and his voice had more edge in it now than he meant it to. "I respect your service. I really do. I can see that helmet means something to you. But this is a modern training environment and we use modern equipment. A steel pot from the 1960s is not rated for anything we do here. I'm not going to let you on my line wearing that. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to ask you to pack up." Walter did not move. He stood there in the dusty lot with that battered helmet buckled under his chin, and he looked at Jesse the way a man looks at another man he has already forgiven in advance for something the other man has not yet done. And then, very slowly, Walter reached up and unbuckled the chin strap, and Jesse thought for a second that the old man was giving in, that the conversation was over, that he could go back to his line and run his course and have a beer that night, and tell his brother-in-law about the stubborn old Vietnam guy who had tried to wear a museum piece on the range. But Walter did not take the helmet off. He just unbuckled the strap and turned the helmet slightly, so that the dent caught the morning sun, and he said, "Before I go, son, I want you to do one thing for me. I want you to put your thumb in that dent, just for a second, and then I'll leave." And that was the moment the grey-haired man in the windbreaker finished his phone call, put the phone back in his pocket, pushed himself off the hood of the Suburban, and started walking across the gravel lot toward them. And the thing Jesse Cade did not yet know, the thing none of those students lined up by the firing berm knew, was that the man walking toward them had been in that valley in 1965 too, and the dent in that helmet was not an abstract piece of history to him. It was the reason he was alive. His name was Harlan Briggs. Most of the people who worked for him over the last 30 years had called him General Briggs, and a smaller number of people, the ones who had been with him in the places nobody talked about, had called him Sir and nothing else. He was 79 years old now, retired 3 years, serving on 2 corporate boards and 1 foundation for wounded veterans, and he had flown into Phoenix the night before to visit his daughter and her family for the weekend. His son-in-law had mentioned over dinner that there was a decent little range up in the foothills where a buddy of his took carbine courses on Saturdays, and Harlan, who had not fired a rifle in nearly a year, and who missed the feeling of it more than he would ever admit, had said he would drive up in the morning and watch for an hour or two just to smell the gun smoke and be around shooters again. He had not signed up for the course. He had not introduced himself to anyone. He had parked at the far end of the observation area, gotten a cup of coffee from the cabin, and settled in against the hood of the rental Suburban to watch the morning unfold. He had seen the old blue F-150 pull into the lot. He had not paid any particular attention to it. He had watched the safety brief from a distance. He had seen the old man in the canvas jacket walk to the truck with the instructor, and then he had seen the helmet. Harlan Briggs had seen a lot of things in his life. He had seen the inside of a fire base in a monsoon. He had seen a C-130 come apart on a runway in Panama. He had seen, as a second lieutenant in November of 1965, a North Vietnamese regular army round strike the steel pot of the rifleman who was dragging him out of a kill zone by the straps of his web gear. And he had seen that rifleman's head snap sideways and his knees buckle for 1 terrible second and then, impossibly, gather itself and keep pulling, because the round had hit the helmet and not the skull underneath it. He had been carried almost 40 yards that afternoon by a corporal whose name he had known for less than 6 hours, and he had lost consciousness before he could thank him, and by the time he woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, the corporal was gone, rotated to another unit, swallowed by the paperwork of a war that was eating paperwork faster than it could be generated. Harlan Briggs had spent the next 58 years looking, quietly and without any real hope, for the man who had carried him, and now, standing in a gravel parking lot in Arizona on a cool October morning, he was looking at the dent that Round had made in that helmet, and he knew, with the absolute certainty that only a man who has been inside his own death knows, that the old man in the canvas jacket was Walter Hollis of a company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. What Jesse Cade did not know was that the worst day of his career had just turned into the most important day of his life, and in 45 seconds he was going to be standing at attention on his own gravel lot, in front of his own students, without ever having been ordered to. Harlan Briggs walked the way older men of his background always walked, unhurried, upright, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes fixed on exactly one point. He came up behind Jesse and stopped about 6 feet away, and Jesse, sensing the presence, turned. And Harlan did not look at Jesse at all. He looked straight past him, at the old man in the canvas jacket, and at the battered steel pot, and at the Dent, and he said, in a voice that was quiet and steady, but that had something shaking inside it, that had nothing to do with age, "Corporal Hollis, a company, 1st of the 7th. Walter went very still. For a long moment he did not answer. His eyes moved over the face of the grey-haired man in the windbreaker, slow and careful, the way a man reads a letter he has been waiting 50 years to receive and is afraid to open. And then something broke and reformed behind Walter's eyes, and his mouth moved once before any sound came out of it, and when the sound came it was barely a whisper. "Lieutenant Briggs." Harlan Briggs's face did something complicated then, a thing that was not quite a smile and not quite anything a camera could have caught, and he took 2 more steps forward and stopped in front of Walter, and without asking permission, he reached up and put the palm of his right hand on the dent in the steel pot, and he left it there for about 4 seconds. Nobody on the firing line was moving. Jesse Cade had not spoken. The kid in the plate carrier had lowered his rifle and was staring with his mouth slightly open. The dentist from Scottsdale had taken off his hat. Harlan Briggs took his hand off the helmet and turned, finally, to look at Jesse, and his voice when he spoke was not the voice he had been using a moment before. It was a voice Jesse Cade had heard echoes of in his own past, in the mouths of men who had earned the right to use it. "Son," Harlan said, "do you have any idea who you have been talking to for the last 20 minutes? Jesse Cade did not answer, because his mouth had stopped working. Harlan Briggs did not wait for him to recover it. "This man," he said, "is Corporal Walter Hollis. On the afternoon of November the 15th, 1965, at a landing zone in the central highlands of Vietnam called X-Ray, this man crawled 40 yards under direct automatic weapons fire from an entrenched NVA battalion to drag a wounded second lieutenant out of a draw where he was going to die. I was that lieutenant. Corporal Hollis was hit twice on the way back, once in the right hip, which is why you may have noticed the way he walks, and once in the head. The round that hit him in the head was a 7.62 by 39 fired from approximately 60 metres. It struck the left side of his steel pot right there where my hand just was. It did not penetrate. If it had penetrated, Corporal Hollis would have died in that draw. And if Corporal Hollis had died in that draw, I would have died about 2 minutes later, because there was nobody else coming for me. Everybody else who tried was already dead. Corporal Hollis was the 4th man to try. He was the only one who made it back. He was 19 years old. I have been looking for him since 1966. Harlan's voice did not rise. He did not need it to. The gravel lot had gone so quiet Jesse could hear the wind in the scrub oak up on the ridge. That helmet on his head, son, is not a museum piece. That helmet is the reason 2 men in this lot are still breathing air this morning, and you were about to make him take it off because your insurance company told you to. Jesse Cade's face had gone the colour of old paper. His clipboard was hanging forgotten at his side. Behind him, one of the private security guys from Phoenix had quietly taken his hat off. The kid in the plate carrier was staring at the ground, and Walter Hollis, for his part, was just standing there with his battered old steel pot on his head, and his hands at his sides and tears running very slowly down both sides of his face, without him making any move to wipe them away. Because for the first time in 58 years, somebody who had been in that drawer with him was standing in front of him and saying the words out loud. There is a thing that happens in a man's chest when he realizes, all at once, that he has just said something unforgivable to someone who did not deserve it. It is not quite shame, because shame comes later. It is closer to vertigo. The ground moves a little under the feet, and the eyes have trouble finding anywhere to rest. Jesse Cade was feeling that exact thing now, and he was feeling it in front of 11 paying students, and a retired 3-star general, and a man who had saved more lives in one afternoon than Jesse Cade had ever saved in his entire career. He opened his mouth, he closed it. He opened it again. And finally, because there was nothing else to do and nothing else to say, Jesse Cade came to attention. He did not think about it. His body did it for him, the way his body still remembered how to do certain things he had not asked it to do in years. He came to attention in the gravel lot of his own range in front of his own students, and he looked straight at Walter Hollis, and he said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Corporal Hollis, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I am sorry. If you will still have me, it would be the honour of my life to have you on my firing line today, with whatever helmet you choose to wear." Walter did not answer right away. He reached up with one hand and wiped his face, slow and embarrassed, the way older men wipe their faces when they have been caught being human in public, and then he nodded once. "Son," he said quietly, "you didn't do anything a lot of other young men wouldn't have done. You were doing your job. I appreciate the apology. Let's go shoot some rifles." And then, and this is the part the dentist from Scottsdale would tell his grandchildren about 20 years later, Walter Hollis turned and looked at the rest of the students, at the kid in the plate carrier and the private security guys and the other shooters, and he said, "Same goes for the rest of you. Nobody here owes me anything. I just came to shoot." And what Jesse Cade did not realize as the 11 students began to move very quietly back toward the firing line was that the kid in the plate carrier had just started crying behind his wraparound shades and was going to spend the rest of his life telling this story to anyone who would listen, because something in him had just broken open that had needed breaking for a long time. Walter Hollis walked to the firing line with the dented M1 steel pot on his head and the old Colt Sporter in his hands, and he took his position at lane 4, and Jesse Cade walked beside him the whole way without saying anything, because there was nothing left to say. The course ran for the next 4 hours. Walter shot it clean. He shot it from the standing, from the kneeling, from the prone. He shot it at 25 yards and 50 yards and 100. His hands were not as fast as they had once been, and his eyes were not as sharp as the younger shooter's eyes, but he did not miss a single target he engaged. And by the end of the second string of fire, the other students had stopped pretending not to watch him. Harlan Briggs stayed the entire time. He did not interfere. He did not offer instruction. He just stood at the back of the line with his coffee in his hand and watched his old corporal run a carbine course 58 years after the afternoon they had last seen each other in the dirt, and every once in a while he would close his eyes for a second and then open them again and keep watching. At the lunch break, Jesse Cade went into the cabin office and stood at the counter for a long time, with his hands flat on the wood, looking at nothing. His brother-in-law found him there and asked what was wrong, and Jesse did not answer for almost a minute. And then he said very quietly, "I almost kicked a man off my range today who is worth more than everything I will ever build in my whole life. And he forgave me for it in about 4 seconds. I don't know what to do with that." His brother-in-law, who was a good man and who did not always know the right thing to say, said the right thing this time. "You shoot the rest of the course with him," he said, "and you remember it." So Jesse Cade went back out to the line after lunch, and he stood at lane 5 next to Walter Hollis, and he shot the rest of the course shoulder to shoulder with him, and he did not say very much. And at the end of the day, when the targets were pulled and the brass was swept, and the students were packing up their trucks, Jesse Cade walked over to Walter's blue F-150 with something in his hand. It was a small piece of steel, polished, about the size of a playing card, with Jesse's range logo laser-etched on one side. He had been planning to hand them out at the end of the course to the students who shot the best scores, a little Instagram-friendly memento. He held it out to Walter with both hands, and his voice was careful. "Mr. Hollis, I want you to have this. It's not much. It's just a thing. But I want you to have it from me, and I want you to know that as long as I own this range, you shoot here for free. Any course. Any time. You call me, I'll clear the line for you. You bring whoever you want. You wear whatever helmet you want." Walter took the piece of steel in his hands and turned it over once and looked at it. And for a second Jesse was afraid he was going to refuse it. But he did not refuse it. He slipped it into the chest pocket of his canvas jacket over his heart, and he patted the pocket once gently, and he said, "Thank you, son. I'll keep this." Then he reached into the back of the truck and pulled out the duffel bag and started carefully putting the steel pot away. Harlan Briggs walked over just as the helmet was disappearing into the canvas. He put his hand on the side of the truck and looked at Walter for a long moment and said, "Walt, I wrote you up for the Silver Star that night. I wrote it up from my hospital bed. Do you know what happened to it?" Walter shook his head slowly. "Paperwork," Harlan said. "Paperwork happened to it. It got lost between 3 different commands in the course of 4 months, and by the time anybody went looking for it, the witnesses were either dead or gone home, and the citation was never finished. I didn't know that until 1972. By then I didn't know where you were. I tried, Walt. I want you to know I tried." Walter listened to all of this without any expression on his face, and when Harlan was done, Walter said only, "It's all right, sir. I wasn't doing it for a medal." Harlan Briggs looked at him for a long time, and then he said, "I know you weren't. That's the problem. That's always been the problem with men like you. But I want you to understand something, Walt. I am going to finish that paperwork. I have 3 weeks of calendar I can clear, and a great many phone numbers I have been saving for exactly this kind of thing. You're going to have that medal on your chest before Christmas, and I am going to put it there myself. Do you understand me, Corporal?" And for the second time that day, Walter Hollis's eyes filled up with tears, and this time he let them come. Walter drove home that afternoon in the blue of 150, with the old steel pot buckled into the passenger seat like a friend. The sun was starting to slant across the high desert, the way it does in late October, and the shadows of the saguaros were getting long, and the wind was coming down off the mountains the way it always did in the afternoon. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. He did not think about the medal. He did not really know yet how to think about the medal. He thought about Ruth instead. He thought about how she would have reacted if she had been sitting in the cab next to him right now, and he thought she probably would not have said very much. She would have reached over and put her hand on top of his hand on the steering wheel, and she would have left it there for a while, and that would have been the whole conversation. He missed her with a sharp, clean ache that he had learned to carry without flinching. When he got home, he parked the truck and carried the duffel bag inside, and he set the steel pot down on the kitchen table next to the second coffee cup he still put out every morning out of habit. He looked at the helmet for a long time. Then he went to the cupboard and got out a soft cloth and a little bottle of oil, and he sat down at the table and began, very slowly and very gently, to clean the old helmet for the first time in almost 60 years. He did not polish the dent. He never would. The dent was not something you polished. The dent was something you kept exactly the way it was, because it had been put there on purpose by a world that had wanted to take a 19-year-old boy away from his mother and his girl and his whole unlived life, and it had failed, and the failure had a shape, and the shape was sacred. He worked on the helmet until the light outside the kitchen window went amber, and then rose, and then blue, and when he was finished he set the helmet on the shelf above the kitchen sink, where Ruth used to keep her good china, and he stood there looking at it for a long time before he turned out the light and went to bed. The story of what happened at the Copper Ridge Tactical Range that Saturday morning did not stay quiet for long. The dentist from Scottsdale told his wife, and the wife told her sister, and the sister posted something on a veterans Facebook group, and within a week the story had travelled the way these stories travel, through phone calls and text messages and comment threads and quiet conversations in VFW halls from Arizona to Virginia. Jesse Cade did not post anything about it himself because it did not feel like his story to tell. But when reporters started calling, and they did start calling, Jesse answered the phone and he told the truth. He told them he had tried to take the helmet off a man who had earned the right to wear it with his own blood. He told them he had been wrong. He told them that Walter Hollis had forgiven him in 4 seconds and then shot his course clean, and that he, Jesse Cade, former United States Marine, was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve that forgiveness. The interviews went viral in the quiet way these things go viral among people who care about these things. Letters started arriving at the range. Old men in other states, other veterans of that valley, other men who had carried steel pots in other wars, wrote to Jesse and to Walter and said thank you and welcome home. And the words had a weight behind them that no algorithm had ever been able to measure. And on a cold, bright morning the week before Christmas, in a small ceremony held at the range at Walter's request because he did not want to travel far, Lieutenant General Harlan Briggs, United States Army, retired, pinned a silver star on the chest of Corporal Walter Hollis, United States Army, retired, 58 years and 1 month after the afternoon the medal had been earned. Walter wore his canvas jacket. He stood at attention. The old steel pot sat on a small table beside him, and everybody in the small crowd understood without being told that the helmet was the one that should have been wearing the medal, because the helmet had done most of the work. When Harlan pinned the star on Walter's jacket, he leaned in close and said something in Walter's ear that nobody else heard, and Walter nodded once, and they held each other by the shoulders for a long moment, 2 old men in a cold desert morning, and then they stepped apart and the small crowd clapped quietly, and that was the end of the ceremony. There are a lot of lessons you could pull out of a story like this one if you wanted to, a lot of clean little morals you could wrap up in a bow and hand to the viewer and call it a day, but the truth is, the only lesson that really matters is the one that Jesse Cade is still carrying around with him in the pocket of his own jacket, the one he figured out that afternoon when he stood at attention in his own gravel lot without being told to. The lesson is this: You do not get to look at an old man in a canvas jacket and decide what he is worth based on the year of his truck or the age of his gear. You do not get to decide from the outside which helmets are museum pieces and which helmets are holy. You do not get to measure a man's right to stand on a firing line by the newness of the plastic strapped to his head. Some men earned their equipment in places you have only read about. Some men are walking around in this country right now with scars you cannot see, and stories they will never tell, and dents in helmets you will never look at. And the only correct response when you meet one of them is to slow down, and shut up, and listen. Walter Hollis still lives in that house outside of Prescott. He still drives the blue F-150. The steel pot still sits on the shelf above the kitchen sink, and the silver star sits in a small wooden box on the dresser in the bedroom, next to a black and white photograph of a 19-year-old boy in jungle fatigues who did not know yet how long his life was going to turn out to be. Every once in a while, when the weather is good, Walter drives up to Copper Ridge Tactical, and Jesse Cade clears lane 4 for him, and Walter stands at that line with the old helmet buckled under his chin, and he fires until his arms are tired, and then he drives home. And if you ever get to see him walking across that gravel lot in his canvas jacket with that battered steel pot in his hands, do yourself a favour. Take your hat off. You will not regret it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, of a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbour, a man who carried something heavy for a long time and never asked you to notice, do one small thing right now. Subscribe to this channel so stories like Walter's keep finding you, and leave one word in the comments below. Just one. Say the word honour. Say it for Walter. Say it for every man who ever came home wearing a helmet with a dent in it and never told anybody why. They are still out there, and they are still listening.